Most people think betrayal arrives like a storm, loud, obvious, impossible to ignore. But the truth is far quieter. Sometimes it begins with silence. Sometimes it begins with the feeling that something in your life has slowly shifted, even though everything around you still looks perfectly normal. And sometimes it begins with a small act of kindness from someone you barely know. A year ago, if someone had asked me about my life, I would have said it was stable, predictable, comfortable. I had a decent job, a peaceful neighborhood, and a home that felt safe. My spouse and I had been married for several years, long enough to settle into routines that felt permanent. Every morning followed the same pattern. Coffee at the kitchen table, quick conversations about the day ahead, then work, errands, dinner, and quiet evenings. From the outside, there was nothing unusual about our life. We didn't argue much. There were no dramatic fights or slammed doors. Friends often described us as the calm couple, the kind of pair that seemed to have everything figured out, but what people see from the outside rarely tells the whole story. Somewhere along the way, the warmth in our home began to fade. Not suddenly, and not in a way that felt alarming at first. It was gradual. Conversations became shorter. Laughter became rare. Instead of talking during dinner, we often sat in silence, scrolling through our phones or staring at the television without really paying attention. At first I blamed stress. Work had been demanding for both of us, and it seemed reasonable that exhaustion could make people distant. Everyone goes through phases like that, I told myself. Relationships evolve. Things slow down. That's normal, but even normal changes leave traces. There were nights when my spouse came home late without much explanation. Nothing suspicious on the surface, just vague comments about work running longer than expected or unexpected errands that needed to be handled. I never pushed too hard for details. Trust had always been a foundation of our relationship, and I didn't want to damage that by acting paranoid. Still, something felt off, not enough to accuse anyone of anything, but enough to create a quiet discomfort that lingered in the back of my mind. It was the kind of feeling you try to ignore because acknowledging it might force you to face something you're not ready to see. Around that same time, someone new moved into the house next door. I remember the first day I noticed them. It was a calm afternoon, and I was outside carrying groceries from my car when they introduced themselves. The conversation lasted less than a minute, just a friendly greeting, a quick exchange of names, and the usual comments neighbors make when someone new arrives in the area. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than a polite interaction, but small moments have a strange way of becoming important later. Over the next few weeks, we crossed paths occasionally. Sometimes it was in the driveway, sometimes while collecting mail, sometimes during quiet evenings when both of us happened to be outside at the same time. Each interaction was brief and casual, yet there was something about the way they spoke that stood out to me. They paid attention. It sounds simple, but when someone listens carefully, when they actually remember things you mention in passing, it leaves an impression. If I said I'd had a long day at work, they'd ask about it the next time we ran into each other. If I mentioned being busy with a project, they'd follow up days later to see how it went. These weren't grand gestures, just small moments of consideration. Meanwhile, the atmosphere inside my own home continued to feel heavier. Evenings became quieter. Sometimes my spouse would sit across the room without saying much, absorbed in their phone. Other nights they'd disappear into another part of the house with vague explanations about needing to finish something. Again, nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious, just distance. One evening I was outside trying to fix a loose hinge on the gate when my neighbor happened to walk by. They noticed the struggle immediately and offered to help. Within minutes the problem was solved, and we ended up talking for a while afterward. It was one of those unexpectedly easy conversations. The kind where you forget to check the time because the exchange feels natural. We talked about work, about the neighborhood, about ordinary life things that normally wouldn't feel remarkable, but when I went back inside later that night, I realized something strange. That 10-minute conversation had been the most relaxed I'd felt all day. The realization made me uncomfortable that I was married. I loved my spouse. At least I believed I did. Feeling that kind of relief from talking to someone else felt wrong somehow, like I was crossing an invisible line even though nothing inappropriate had happened. So I tried not to think about it. Days passed, routines continued, and life moved forward. My spouse remained distant, though I kept telling myself it was temporary. Work stress. Fatigue. Maybe just one of those phases couples go through. Meanwhile, my neighbor continued to appear in small, ordinary moments at a quick wave while passing by. A short conversation near the mailbox. Once they brought over a package that had accidentally been delivered to their door. Another time they asked if I needed help carrying something heavy from the car. Simple kindness, nothing more. At least, that's what I told myself, but looking back now, those small gestures were the beginning of something I didn't understand yet. They were quiet reminders that attention, kindness, and genuine concern still existed in the world around me, and eventually, one of those moments would lead to a conversation that changed everything I thought I knew about my life. After that evening, running into my neighbor stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like a quiet part of my routine. It never happened in a dramatic way. We didn't suddenly start spending hours together or planning conversations. It was always small moments, brief interactions that seemed ordinary on the surface but slowly became something I began to look forward to. Some mornings we crossed paths while leaving for work. Other times it happened in the evening when one of us stepped outside for fresh air. The conversations were never complicated. Just simple questions about how the day went or casual observations about the neighborhood, but there was a difference between those conversations and the ones I had at home. When my neighbor asked how I was doing, they actually listened to the answer. At home, most evenings had become predictable. My spouse usually arrived late, often looking distracted. Dinner felt more like a task than a shared moment. We would sit across from each other, sometimes exchanging a few sentences about work, but the conversations rarely lasted long. Eventually one of us would drift toward our phone or television, and silence would fill the room again. I kept telling myself that relationships naturally settled into quieter rhythms over time. Passion fades, routines take over, and life becomes practical rather than exciting. That explanation made sense logically, but emotionally something still felt wrong. Meanwhile, the neighbors' friendliness never felt forced. They had a way of making ordinary conversations feel meaningful. One evening we ended up talking for nearly 20 minutes while standing outside near the driveway. It started with a simple comment about the weather but gradually turned into a discussion about work stress and the strange pressure adults carry without talking about it. At some point during the conversation, I admitted that work had been exhausting lately. I hadn't planned to say it out loud. It just slipped out naturally. Instead of giving the usual quick response people offer, my neighbor asked a few thoughtful questions. They didn't interrupt or rush the conversation. They simply listened. That small moment stayed with me longer than I expected. It had been a long time since anyone had seemed genuinely interested in how I was feeling. Over the next couple of weeks, the conversations continued to happen randomly. Sometimes they lasted only a minute or two. Other times they stretched longer without either of us noticing the time passing. The topics were always harmless: work, hobbies, small frustrations about daily life. Nothing personal enough to feel inappropriate. Still, I started noticing something uncomfortable about myself. Those short conversations were becoming the highlight of my day. I didn't want to admit it. The thought alone made me feel guilty. I was married, and nothing about my neighbor's kindness should have carried that kind of emotional weight. But the truth was simple: it felt good to talk to someone who seemed present. At home, the distance between my spouse and me kept growing. They had started keeping their phone with them constantly. Even during dinner, it sat face down beside their plate. When messages arrived, they often glanced at the screen quickly before turning it away. It wasn't obvious enough to accuse them of anything, but it was noticeable. One night I asked casually why they had been working so late lately. The answer came quickly and without much detail. A big project. Extra responsibilities. Nothing unusual. The explanation sounded reasonable, yet something about the tone felt rehearsed. That I didn't push the conversation further. Part of me didn't want to know more. As long as everything remained vague, I could keep believing the distance between us was temporary. A few days later, my neighbor and I ended up talking again while I was bringing groceries inside. They offered to help carry a couple of bags, and we walked toward the house together. During that short walk, they mentioned something interesting. They said they'd noticed the neighborhood had become unusually quiet at night recently. Fewer people outside, fewer lights on. It was an innocent observation, but it reminded me how often my spouse had been coming home late. For a brief second, an uncomfortable thought crossed my mind. What if those late nights weren't really about work? I pushed the idea away immediately. Jumping to conclusions would only create unnecessary problems. Trust meant giving someone the benefit of the doubt, especially in a marriage. Still, the thought didn't disappear completely. Later that week, another small detail caught my attention. My spouse received a phone call while we were sitting in the living room. Instead of answering it normally, they stepped outside to take it. The call lasted only a few minutes, but when they returned, they seemed slightly nervous. When I asked who it was, they answered quickly, "Just someone from work asking about a schedule change." Again, nothing suspicious on the surface, yet the uneasy feeling returned. Over the following days, those feelings began stacking up. Each moment by itself seemed insignificant, but together they created a quiet tension I couldn't ignore anymore. Meanwhile, my neighbor continued to be kind in the same effortless way they always had been. One evening, they brought over a small package that had been mistakenly delivered to their address. Another time, they asked if I wanted to join them for a short walk around the block after dinner. The invitation surprised me, but it didn't feel inappropriate. It felt like something neighbors naturally did. During that walk, we talked about ordinary things again. But toward the end of the conversation, they said something unexpected. They mentioned that I seemed a little stressed lately. The comment caught me off guard. I hadn't realized it was that noticeable. For a moment, I considered brushing it off, but instead I admitted that things at home had been feeling distant lately. I didn't go into detail. I just said the atmosphere had changed and I couldn't quite explain why. My neighbor didn't try to analyze the situation or give dramatic advice. They simply said that sometimes people notice changes before they understand them. Then they added something that lingered in my mind long after the conversation ended. They said that when something feels different for a long time, there's usually a reason behind it. At the time, I didn't realize how close that quiet observation was to the truth, because only a few days later, a small piece of information would surface. Something so simple, yet so unsettling, that it would make me question everything I believed about my marriage. The first real crack in my reality appeared in a way I never expected. It wasn't a dramatic discovery or some shocking confrontation. It was something small. Quiet. The kind of moment most people might overlook if they weren't already carrying a sense that something wasn't right. It happened on an ordinary evening. I had finished dinner alone because my spouse had sent a message saying they would be late again. That explanation had become common by then. I barely reacted to it anymore. Instead, I cleaned the kitchen, stepped outside for fresh air, and tried to clear my head. My neighbor was outside too, leaning against the fence while scrolling through their phone. We exchanged the usual greeting, and within seconds we were talking again the way we often did. The conversation started casually, just another quiet moment between two neighbors sharing the end of a long day. But somewhere in the middle of it, they mentioned something that immediately caught my attention. They said they had seen my spouse earlier that week. At first, that didn't seem strange. The neighborhood wasn't large, and people crossed paths all the time. But the way they described it made me pause. They said they had seen my spouse at a small cafe across town, not alone. The words landed softly, but the meaning behind them felt heavy. My first instinct was to dismiss it. Maybe it was a coworker. Maybe a meeting. Maybe something completely harmless. That I asked casually who they had been with. My neighbor shrugged slightly and said they didn't recognize the person. They just remembered noticing it because the two of them looked close. There was no accusation in their voice. No suggestion that something inappropriate had happened. They were simply sharing something they had observed, but the moment they said it, the uneasy feeling that had been following me for months suddenly felt impossible to ignore. I forced a small smile and brushed it off in the conversation. I told them it was probably someone from work and that my spouse had been dealing with projects lately. They nodded and didn't push the topic further, but after we said goodbye and I went back inside, my mind refused to settle. The image formed in my head immediately. My spouse sitting across from someone in a cafe, talking the way we used to talk years ago. Smiling the way they rarely smiled at home anymore. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things. Jumping to conclusions would only create problems where none existed. Still, that night I barely slept. The next few days felt different. Every small detail started catching my attention in ways it never had before. When my spouse left the room to answer a message, I noticed it. When they came home late, I noticed the exact time. I wasn't proud of how closely I was observing everything, but once doubt enters your mind, it changes how you see the world. A week later, the moment came that destroyed whatever illusions I still had. My spouse had gone to take a shower, leaving their phone on the kitchen counter. I had no intention of looking at it. At least that's what I told myself at first, but then the screen lit up with a message. Just one line appeared in the notification preview: "I miss you already." My heart dropped. For a few seconds I stood there staring at the phone, hoping there would be some innocent explanation. Maybe it was meant for someone else. Maybe the wording meant something different than it sounded, but deep down I already knew. My hand moved before I had time to think about it. I picked up the phone and opened the message. The conversation thread was impossible to misinterpret. Dozens of messages. Late night conversations. Plans to meet again soon. Words that clearly belonged to people who were more than just friends. The room felt suddenly smaller. Every quiet moment from the past several months rushed back into my memory. The late nights. The guarded phone. The distant conversations at dinner. The vague explanations that it all made sense now. My chest felt tight as I placed the phone back on the counter exactly where it had been. I walked into the living room and sat down, staring at nothing while my thoughts raced. Anger came first. A sharp, overwhelming wave of it. Then disbelief. Then something heavier than both, betrayal. I kept asking myself the same question over and over. How long had this been happening? Weeks? Months? Had the distance between us started because of the affair, or had the affair started because we had already grown distant? The answers didn't really matter. The truth was simple: the person I trusted most had been living a second life without me. When my spouse came out of the shower later that night, I said nothing. I couldn't. My emotions were still tangled together, too raw to turn into words. Instead, I went outside. The cool night air helped a little, but the weight inside my chest didn't disappear. I must have been standing there longer than I realized, because eventually my neighbor stepped outside again. They noticed me immediately. One look at my face was enough. They walked over slowly and asked if everything was okay. For a moment I considered lying. Pretending everything was fine. Keeping the truth locked inside where no one else could see it, but something about their calm presence made that impossible. The words came out before I could stop them that I told them I had just discovered my spouse was having an affair. Saying it out loud made the reality feel even heavier that I expected awkward silence or uncomfortable sympathy, but instead my neighbors simply listened. They didn't interrupt. They didn't judge. They didn't try to offer quick solutions, they just stood there and let me speak. For the first time since finding those messages, I felt like I could breathe again. The pain didn't disappear, but sharing it made the weight slightly easier to carry, and as the conversation slowly came to an end, one thing became clear: the kindness my neighbor had been showing me for months suddenly meant far more than I had ever realized, because at that moment, when my entire world felt like it had collapsed, they were the only person who truly understood what I was going through, and somehow, without planning it, they had become the person I trusted most. The days after discovering the messages felt unreal. I moved through my routines the way people do when they're trying to function while their mind is somewhere else. Every familiar part of my life suddenly looked different. The house felt colder. Conversations felt forced. Even the quiet moments carried a weight that hadn't been there before. For 2 days I said nothing to my spouse about what I had seen. I needed time to think clearly. Reacting immediately would have turned the situation into a shouting match, and I didn't want anger to control what happened next. What I wanted more than anything was clarity, but pretending everything was normal became impossible. Every time my spouse checked their phone or stepped away to answer a message, the memory of those words came back. "I miss you already." Those 4 words had shattered years of trust in a matter of seconds. Eventually I realized the silence between us was worse than the truth itself. One evening after dinner, I asked if we could talk. My voice sounded calm, but inside my chest my heart was racing. My spouse looked surprised. We rarely had serious conversations anymore. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then I told them I knew. The change in their expression was immediate. Confusion appeared first, followed by a brief flicker of panic. They asked what I meant, but the question sounded weak, like they already understood that I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse them angrily. I simply told them about the message I had seen and the conversation thread that followed. The silence that came afterward felt endless. Finally they exhaled slowly and looked down at the table. That was the moment I knew the truth was real. At first they tried to explain it away. They said it hadn't meant anything serious. They said it had started during a stressful period at work and had gotten out of control. They insisted it wasn't supposed to hurt anyone, but every explanation sounded smaller than the damage it had caused. I asked the only question that truly mattered: how long? The answer hurt more than I expected. The relationship had been going on for months. Almost the entire period when I had been noticing the distance between us. Hearing that confirmed something painful. The loneliness I had been feeling hadn't been imaginary. While I was trying to understand why our relationship felt different, my spouse had already been investing their attention somewhere else. For a few minutes we talked honestly in a way we hadn't in a long time. But the conversation didn't repair anything. If anything, it made the reality clearer. Trust had been broken, and some things can't simply return to the way they were. By the time the discussion ended, I understood something important. Staying in the marriage out of habit or fear wouldn't fix the damage. It would only prolong a situation that had already collapsed. So I made a decision that it wasn't dramatic or impulsive. It was calm, quiet, and deeply certain. That I told my spouse I couldn't continue the relationship. The words felt heavy as they left my mouth, but they also carried a strange sense of relief. For months I had been trying to ignore the growing distance between us. Now the truth had forced everything into the open. The next few weeks were difficult. Separating lives that had been connected for years is never simple. There were practical decisions to make, conversations with family, and moments where the reality of the situation hit harder than expected. But something surprising also happened during that time. Without the constant tension inside my home, I started feeling lighter, not happy exactly, but free from the confusion that had been weighing on me for so long. Through all of it, my neighbor remained quietly supportive. They never pushed themselves into my life or tried to take advantage of the situation. They simply checked in from time to time. Sometimes it was a short conversation outside. Other times it was a quick message asking how I was holding up. Those small gestures meant more than they probably realized. When someone experiences betrayal, it changes the way they see people. Trust becomes fragile. You start questioning intentions, wondering whether kindness is genuine or temporary. But my neighbor never gave me a reason to doubt them. Their support stayed steady and simple. They listened when I needed to talk and respected my space when I needed silence. Months passed, and life slowly began to feel normal again. That I focused on rebuilding routines that belonged entirely to me. Work became easier to concentrate on. Even the quiet evenings at home stopped feeling lonely. During that time, the friendship with my neighbor continued to grow naturally. What started as brief conversations over a fence turned into longer talks during evening walks. We shared stories about our past, our goals, and the strange ways life sometimes changes direction when we least expect it. There was never a moment where things suddenly shifted from friendship to something else. No dramatic confession or sudden realization. Instead, the connection deepened slowly. One evening while we were talking outside, I noticed something simple but meaningful. For the first time in a long while, I felt genuinely peaceful, not distracted. Not worried about hidden truths. Just present in the moment. That realization made me smile. A year earlier, I would have never imagined how much my life would change because of something as small as a friendly greeting from the person next door. The betrayal that once felt like the end of everything had quietly pushed me toward a completely different path. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see at the time. Sometimes the people who hurt us reveal the truth we've been avoiding. And sometimes the kindness of someone unexpected becomes the steady ground that helps us stand again. All it took was a neighbor who cared enough to listen, and that simple kindness ended up changing my life in ways I never could have predicted.